You will need lecture outline number 16, entitled The Career Missionary. Still needed? Many of the thoughts, much of the outline that I provide you in this lecture, I drew a number of years ago from Winston Crawley's book entitled Global Mission, A Story to Tell. It's a history of the Southern Baptist Foreign Mission Board. In all of my classes, in terms of class materials, in terms of the preparation of lecture materials, I always find myself updating my notes from time to time, even from semester to semester, not necessarily wholesale changes in what I present in the lectures, but a tweaking to keep some things fresh, to reflect present realities or changes or realities that have come about. The present material, that is this lecture, including this question concerning the career missionary, that is one who goes and plants his life in one place for a lifetime ministry, becoming a part of the people, of the culture, of the language, and living and working long time there, long term there. The question is, that sort of a person still needed? That question I was asking all the way back in the 1980s, and in fact my response to it was prepared in the 1980s, and again drawing quite a few thoughts from Winston Crawley's book. Because that material, as I had originally prepared it, seemed to me to do an inadequate job of representing the present trends in Southern Baptist International Missions. At one point, I had dropped this lecture from the materials for this course altogether. It's not that this material, it's not that I ever thought that this material was foundationally wrong. It's just that it seemed to me that at one point, this material did not clearly represent or reflect the most current thinking, emphases, and strategies that were found, for instance, with the Southern Baptist Foreign Mission Board. Essentially, I began to think this lecture's out of date. I need to get rid of it, and though the career missionary still is, in fact, I would argue, and I think there are many within the International Mission Board who would argue, is not still an integral part, but the integral part of Southern Baptist international work. But there's no doubt that there has been a much greater emphasis in recent years placed on the use of shorter-term personnel and volunteers. For instance, in the counting of the number of missionaries on the field, whereas the board used to report only those long-term career missionaries, now in the number that you'll hear, when I have reported to you that the International Mission Board now has approximately 5,600 missionaries, that includes not only long-term career missionaries, but it also includes a number of 2- and 3-year missionaries assigned as International Service Corps missionaries, or as journeymen, or in other capacities. And although the International Mission Board, I believe, still resolutely, and I think that's an appropriate term to use here, though the International Mission Board still resolutely considers the work of the career missionary as primary in its strategy. The focus is on appointing and sending long-term career missionaries. Yet that strategy perhaps is a bit more nuanced today than it was in past decades. Let me go back to the lecture that I had jettisoned. I'm going to go through that material with some comments, some updates, some observations along the way. But let me step back in time just a bit and give you my thoughts, Winston Crawley's thoughts also, regarding the justification for such a strong emphasis on long-term career missionaries. Even back in the 1980s, Winston Crawley was able to report or acknowledge that a larger and larger portion of missionaries reported by mission agencies, at that time, more and more of them were short-term missionaries. In fact, there are a number of agencies and groups, parachurch organizations, that send out only short-term personnel. They do not send out long-term career missionaries. Even some of the major mission boards and agencies have begun to downplay long-term missionary involvement and focusing more on rapid advance, short-term personnel, short-term ministries. In fact, let me pause for just a moment and mention once again the book Operation World. I had drawn a number of statistics from that book when we were taking a look into the 21st century, but also looking at the present state of the world. In the back of Operation World is an appendix in which there is a listing of largely, I believe, if I remember correctly, and certainly this should be the case, evangelical type mission sending agencies, the names of those agencies and boards and groups, the types of ministries that they focus on, also the duration of those ministries, long-term career or short-term. And you might find that to be an interesting appendix or document simply to peruse. And you get an idea of the variety of different mission sending entities, some focusing on long-term personnel, others on short-term, others kind of a mixture, some focusing on primarily or even specifically medical missions, others on disaster relief and human needs, others more on church planting. But it's an interesting document, and I would encourage you to take a look at that. The Southern Baptist International Mission Board, however, has continued to emphasize long-range commitment and service. In fact, at one point, and I referenced this in my earlier lecture, the board regards, and I quote from some of their documents, the board regards as basic the concept of the career missionary. And again, I do believe, and in fact, it seems to me, I did not go back and find this, but it does seem to me that I have seen even in the most recently updated materials from the International Mission Board a statement regarding the value and the importance of long-term career missionaries. This still seems to be the backbone and the focus, in fact, I know it to be the focus of the work of the International Mission Board, long-term career missionaries. R.K. Orchard, I quoted from him a number of lectures ago from the book Missions in a Time of Testing. And let me reread that quote because it applies here as well as it did in the previous context when we were trying to arrive at some definitions of terms. R.K. Orchard wrote, "To draw the conclusion, as is sometimes done, that we are all missionaries now is an unwarrantable oversimplification. It ignores the differentiation of gifts and functions within the body of which the New Testament speaks, and thereby destroys the possibility of particular callings of Christians to engage especially in one particular form of service. It ignores the fact that there are groups of people in areas of life in which the Christ event will not be proclaimed unless some Christians are specially set aside and specially equipped to live amongst those groups or within those areas for the purpose of bearing witness within them to the Christ event." Orchard's point is simply this. Clearly, there are those who have special gifts, who have giftings that make them specially suited to service within another cultural setting. There are those who seem to have a particular facility in learning languages. Clearly also, the Spirit of God does direct individuals, some believers, for ministry, specific ministry in other lands, in other cultures, in other contexts, rather than their home context. And such persons and their ministries would fit what the International Mission Board understands as the biblical concept of missionary and long-term career missionary when that individual goes and for a long commitment of time to plant his or her life there on the field field to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. We talked about the incarnational principle, the value of the value of planting one's life long term, becoming like the people, learning about the people, beginning to know them, learning to love them, learning their language, learning their culture, learning what makes them tick. I once heard a pastor, an elderly pastor, say to a group of young pastors, a bunch of us young preacher boys, and he provided some counsel. He said, and this was a man who very much prioritized the ministry of the Word, spent a great deal of time in sermon preparation in his study, and focused on the teaching, the preaching ministry of the pastor as he should have. And so no one questioned his credentials in the area of preaching and focus on the Word. And yet, an interesting word of counsel that he gave to us. He said, when you first go to a church as a pastor, I don't want to pull you out of your study. I don't want to pull you away from the Word of God. You must spend that time there. But let me encourage you to spend as much time as you can with the people. Spend time drinking coffee with them. Spend time working on their cars with them. If you are ministering in a rural context, spend time out in the fields with them, hunting with them, fishing with them. If you're in an urban context, go to ball games with them. But just spend time with them. Learn, get to know them, learn them, begin to love them, and let them love you. The same sort of counsel can be given to missionaries, and rightfully so, legitimately so, to plant yourself amongst the people, learn about them, come to know them and to love them, and become a part of them. And so M. Theron Rankin once wrote, "If God could have saved the world by remoteness, by remaining separated from men, would He have incarnated Himself in human form and become in fashion as a man to live among men as one of them?" He continued, this former president of the Foreign Mission Board, "We have never made an approach to the world that can be more convincing than the sending of missionaries who, in the name of Christ, will lose themselves and bury their lives among the people to whom they go. Missionaries who live and serve along with the people, who speak their language, who acquire the capacities of sympathy for their miseries and human hungers, and who learn to love them personally and individually." Dr. R. Keith Parks, also former president of the Foreign Mission Board, he wrote, and reported by Winston Crawley in his book, "There will be an ongoing emphasis on the necessity for the people called of God to go forth to incarnate the gospel in a needy world. This will require on the part of those who respond a commitment of unlimited length, which enables one to learn the language, become familiar with the culture, and communicate the gospel in a way acceptable to the people of a particular culture." People with this kind of commitment are career missionaries. And though, again, the board's approach has been nuanced a bit, and I think it's not so much for the International Mission Board a case of do we focus on career missionaries or short-term missionaries. The obvious focus is on career missionaries. But shorter-term personnel and even volunteers now more and more increasingly come alongside the career missionaries in support roles and companion roles and work alongside the career missionaries. I believe it is correct to say for the International Mission Board, it is not so much an either-or proposition, but a both-and proposition. Continuing to emphasize long-term career ministry service, at the same time encouraging and facilitating the ministry of Southern Baptists, encouraging Southern Baptists, enlisting Southern Baptists across the board to come alongside and to help in the work of missions. Someone has said that sharing the gospel is essentially personal. that television and other methods of mass communication certainly can be highly valuable supplemental evangelistic approaches. We can beam the gospel in by satellite, by radio waves. We can send the gospel in by printed word. But someone might legitimately ask, would anyone then suggest a televised morning broadcast as an adequate substitute for the local pastor and the ministries of other Christian workers as believers congregate together and fellowship together on a regular basis within the local church? M. Theron Rankin, speaking in a seminary chapel, insisted that a loudspeaker on a cross will never win the world. There must be a man on the cross. And again, we do need to be careful here. I do not believe that Theron Rankin was suggesting that somehow or other we become little Christs. We have addressed this issue already. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it. He is not suggesting that somehow or another we actually find ourselves placed up on the cross for people. He is simply pointing to the fact that as Jesus left His place in heaven and came to us, in the same way, the career long-term missionary leaves his or her place and goes to others and lives amongst them and begins to know them and begins to love them and ministers long-term amongst them. And so, this sort of ministry is not possible merely by brief or superficial contact. It requires long-range, in-depth involvement. Language takes time to learn. Adaptation to culture takes time. And so the International Mission Board continues to stress, to focus on long-term career appointment. There are other personnel, there are clearly other categories of service in which individuals may go and serve internationally. And again, this is not an either-or proposition or approach, but a both-and. Some of the other categories, some of the other personnel that go out. We have mentioned the International Service Corps missionaries. These are individuals these are fully funded positions. They go for 2 to 3 year assignments. They are very specific assignments. They are goal-oriented, task-oriented. An International Service Corps missionary might be appointed, might be sent to a frontier area, a new area, but also might be sent to work alongside career missionaries to help with some task. For instance, I know of someone who had a strong background in library sciences, and a particular seminary needed a significant amount of help in ordering and arranging the materials in the library, and this individual went for 2 years and worked with the seminary administration and faculty to get the library in shape. The work was done, and she came home. There are any number of other types of assignments that can be accepted through the International Service Corps appointment. There are other categories of service also. Journeyman. This is a category of service for college students, or actually students who have graduated from college and are still below the age of 29. These are 2-year assignments, close-ended, fully funded in the same way that the ISC assignments are fully funded by the International Mission Board. There are other possibilities for those who are older. The associate track for older missionaries who would not be appointed for a lifetime, long-term commitment, but would go for 3 years or more, and just depending on the assignment, the amount of time needed, and those assignments could be repeated, and so that someone could finish out an assignment and then add additional time to it. So there are a number of different ways that Southern Baptists can go to the field apart from serving long-term as long-term career missionaries. Of course, there are those volunteers who go out to the world. This past year, I believe that we had somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 individual short-term, 2-week to 4-month volunteers to go to the fields of the world to assist our career missionaries or to do other types of work. And these are positions that are self-funded, but they are organized, they are arranged through the International Mission Board in conjunction with our people on the field. Career service, ISC, journeyman service, 2 to 3 years, volunteer service. But the International Mission Board is committed to sending out those missionaries who themselves are committed to taking the gospel to the world, to, as the board has put it, to discipling the nations. And there are many different avenues of service, many different opportunities for service for Southern Baptists. Let me encourage you to go to the International Mission Board website. It is www.imb.org. And you can click around there on that page, and you will find information about these various categories of service, how one is appointed to serve with the International Mission Board. There's also the opportunity to review some of the job requests, personnel requests from the field. There's just a lot of information that is available to you, and I think you'll find it quite interesting. Many different ways for you and for other Southern Baptists to serve internationally with the IMB. Before we close this lecture, I just want to do one other thing. I am often approached by students or people in churches, Southern Baptist church members, who will say to me, Dr. Martin or Brother George, the International Mission Board probably couldn't use me, could they? I mean, I'm not a preacher. I've never been to seminary. I'm not seminary trained. The IMB probably could not use me. I heard Jerry Rankin once respond to a question along those lines. Probably the IMB couldn't use me. Is that correct? And he responded, if you have a heart for the world, the International Mission Board can use you. And there are just so many different ways that the IMB can plug individuals into ministry, so many different platforms, so many different avenues to get overseas and to use abilities, skills, backgrounds, educational and training backgrounds in the preaching and the sharing of the gospel and in church planting around the world. I have a list before me. It's a 3-column list. I will upload this also to the internet so that you can have it. But just some of the different types of jobs or types of service that people are engaged in through the International Mission Board. I have this list of 98 different types of service, and this is not an exhaustive list. Listen to some of these. General evangelist, English language pastor. I'm just going to skip through this a bit and read a few that seem quite interesting to me. Religious literature distributor, religious education teacher, seminary instructor, music promoter, school chaplain, women's worker, conference encampment director, secondary school teacher, medical school teacher, college teacher, university administrator, MK, missionary kid, dorm parents, occupational therapist, youth worker, literacy worker, physician, physician's assistant, dentist, pharmacist, nurse, x-ray technologist, veterinarian, animal husbandman, architect, auditor, engineer, mechanic, linguist, pilot, visual aids specialist, recreation worker, business manager, bookkeeper, hospital extension evangelist, computer programmer, analyst, secretary, social worker, writer, mission administrator, church growth consultant, church and home. This is a very broad category that many, particularly young mothers and wives, choose that allows them to devote themselves to family, to children, their education and upbringing, but also find their own ways, their own avenues or approaches to ministry wherever they find themselves. And so many different ways, many different types of service that are available to Southern Baptists who wish to serve through the International Mission Board. If you have a heart for the nations, if you have a desire, if your heart is that is God's heart, as we have talked about, if you have the heart of God for the nations, for the peoples of the world, the International Mission Board can probably plug you in somewhere for some duration of time, though the focus and the emphasis continues to be on long-term career missionary service. And so, in answer to our question at the beginning of this lecture, is the career missionary needed? The IMB would answer absolutely. And yet there are so many others who come alongside the long-term career missionary, who work with that missionary and alongside and support ministries, and in other ways. There are short-term missionaries or shorter-term missionaries and assignments that are able to accomplish certain specific tasks that assist the long-term missionaries. There are all sorts of ways that you can be involved in international missions with the IMB. The career missionary is still needed, absolutely, but so many others are needed also to come alongside and work. It's not an either-or, but a both-and situation with the International Mission Board. We're going to continue to look at a number of contemporary issues, selected issues in missiology. When we come to our next lecture, we're going to look at a question that is asked constantly concerning missions and the gospel. I hear it everywhere I go, and we definitely need to be prepared to give an answer to this question. It is an important question. We cannot afford to misanswer, to provide a faulty, unbiblical answer to this question. What is the question? Well, listen to the next lecture, and you'll have the question, and you'll have what I believe is the biblical answer to it.